It's time for our Newsmaker of the Morning. Boeing Chairman Dave Calhoun. The Dow component, as you know, separated its CEO and chairman roles amid the 737 MAX crisis, naming Calhoun as chairman on October 11th. It's been relatively quiet since then in terms of on-camera interviews. This morning, he's speaking out in a Squawk Box exclusive. Dave joins us now with our own Phil LeBeau at CNBC Global Headquarters. Phil, good morning. Good morning, Mr. Calhoun.
Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Joe.
And I know you guys have a number of questions for Dave. And Dave, let's begin first off. You and I were talking before you came out here.
Yeah.
Big question right off the bat is about the compensation for Dennis Muilenburg. This came up on Capitol Hill. Yep. You have some news regarding how that's going to be changing, correct?
Yeah, I do. Of course, it was sort of obvious to everyone that was an uncomfortable question for Dennis. Dennis doesn't like to speak in behalf of board activities. Anyway, Dennis called me Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, with the purpose of suggesting that he not take any compensation for 2019 as in the form of bonuses, which is, of course, most of your compensation. It came in two fronts. One, no long-term bonus, and three, no consideration for equity grants until the MAX in its entirety is back in the air and flying safely. As you know, MAX in its entirety takes us through all of the next calendar year and probably into the beginning of 2021. So it was a significant move on his part. Nothing surprising about that for me, nothing. Dennis's character always does the right thing. Dennis was very uncomfortable in that situation. And Dennis, more than anything, walked out of the evening in between the two hearings where he listened for several hours to every story that the victims' families presented to him. Changed him for life. He was doing all the right things, but now he's gotten in his core, he's gotten his bones, and it had an enormous impact.
Enormous impact, but you know that people are watching you right now saying, why is Dennis Muilenburg still CEO of Boeing? Yeah,
because from the vantage point of our board, Dennis has done everything right. From the beginning. Remember, Dennis didn't create this problem. But from the beginning, he knew that MCAS should and could be done better. And he has led a program to rewrite MCAS to alleviate all of those conditions that ultimately beset two unfortunate crews and the families and victims. And he's done that incredibly well. He manages it every single day. He keeps the board abreast of everything that happens every day. And he's done that well. And he has set us up for a return to service. Because I will remind everybody, return to service starts the day it's certified. It's not over when it's certified. There's no victory in that, right? We have to get the airplanes that our customers have put on the ground. We have to get them back in the air. We have to assist them every step of the way. And we have to get the airplanes that we've built and are ready for delivery to customers back in the air as well. That's a long program. It's at least a year, and it's a tough, important task, and we believe he's up to it.
Joe, I know you have a question for Dave.
Yeah, going back to the compensation issue, Dave. So that takes care of this last incident. But is there anything being changed by the board about clawback provisions for something other than fraud or whatever you normally put in that in the bylaws there, which would cover reputational damage, or which would then cover safety issues, because safety issues are notoriously hard to have a clawback provision for, because it's unintentional and we know things happen. This is a high-risk business and everything else. But if it was reputational, I think that would be a way of making that permanent for the next situation, and if, God forbid, if there is one at Boeing.
So, Joe, the provisions around clawback, first of all, let me just say we're not looking for a clawback on Dennis. And there is nothing at any stage anywhere that suggests there's culpability involved in any of that. With respect to those provisions, there's no doubt we'll take a look at that. There's no question. Everything related to safety and its impact on compensation and many other facets of the operations of our company will be turned over, looked at hard, and many revisions will be made. So I don't want to predict the outcome, but you can be sure we'll look at it.
It's been reported that I don't know how many engineers are on the board of Airbus, but I know that there's fewer at Boeing right now. Your career, you're all over the place at GE. I don't know whether you need an engineering degree, but you've got a lot of manufacturing expertise, obviously. Muilenburg is an aerospace engineer, so that's one, which makes me think maybe this is a guy that you want here right now, in spite of everything that happened last week, in spite of what happened in the last 8-10 months, whatever it is. This is a guy you want. But do you need more engineers on the board at a company like Boeing?
I don't believe we do. I think we have an incredibly diverse board. It's very strong. Everybody has a view and an opinion. We tap into it. I personally tap into it on a very, very frequent basis. Not just in board meetings, but individually. The Safety Committee Chair, Admiral Giambastiani, who I believe is just really one of the terrific leaders, he has led an effort to study, look at, bring outside experts in to look at all of our safety practices across the Boeing commercial and broadly across the whole company. And we have embarked on a program that will make significant changes to all of that. And I think he's doing it the right way. And just one last comment, Joe. You may recall in my life at leadership in the aviation business at GE, where we built the engines on the airplane. I joined that business 10 years after a horrific accident in Sioux City in 1989. That accident, all of the major changes that occurred inside of GE and the way we stood up safety practices ultimately created independence with our engineering organization and visibility right down to the nooks and crannies of the company. All of that was present when I joined 10 years later, and everybody referred to it. That's what's going to happen in this company. That's exactly the path we're going to have to take.
But Muilenburg, that is an asset.
He is an asset.
So you think he'll be here in a year, Dave? Or I've seen people say once it's back in the air, 6 months later, maybe there's a change.
Yeah, and why speculate on that? You know how difficult and how big the program is and remains through the course of the next year, right? If we successfully get from where he started to where we need to end up, I would view that as a very significant milestone and something that speaks to his leadership and his courage and his ability to execute and get us through this. And yes, the board deliberates every single meeting on the subject of our leaders and how well they're doing and do they have our confidence. And to date, and as recently as Sunday evening, he has our confidence.
Dave, there had been a lot of news reports in the last month that said that you were brought in to kind of manage strained relationships between Dennis Muilenburg and the board. How would you react to that characterization? Yeah, I don't. That's a false characterization. Dennis has a relationship with all of our board members. He talks to them. They each bring a sort of a special skill to him. My appointment of chairman was very much about division of duty. And that experience I brought from my aviation days and what I think is the significant overhauls that have to go on inside our company to increase visibility on the subject of safety straight up to the board and right down to the bottom of the organization and create more independence in the functions that represent safety. Do you and Dennis see eye to eye on what has to happen to get the MAX program back in the air and approved by regulators around the globe? Yes, we do. And I think, honestly, Dennis appreciates this help.
Dave, I'm curious. A lot of people will hear this, and they'll hear that the board is deliberating or meeting on a regular basis, discussing this. But there are a lot of people who look at the board over the last year and say, what have you guys been doing? Why haven't you done more sooner? Were you too slow to act as a board?
Well, no one's ever going to claim that they were fast enough. And I'm not going to be the last person to say that. But I will say this has been one very active board. Between Indonesia and Ethiopia, roughly 4 months, very tough time. Just trying to get everything we can out of the NTSB investigation or the Indonesian equivalent of that, learn the facts, understand what has to get done. Fairly early on, that assumption, that deadly assumption around what a pilot would do in that circumstance when that boundary condition was tested, that started to come to light. No question about that. Ethiopia happens, everything changes, and our board is in full gear, and me included. We went down to the engineering organizations with a new safety committee that at that time we didn't know if it was permanent or temporary, but we were on with it. What we learned in that committee is the process they undertook to make the decisions and ultimately surfacing that flawed assumption. And anyway, it was sort of clear to us, no one was hiding anything. It was a set of engineering decisions that ended up being wrong. And our job now is to make sure that whatever processes we have, whatever process our regulator has, that those processes never allow for this to happen again. That assumption, just because history suggested it was a great assumption, just because history and the record suggested that, turned out it wasn't right, and we have to test that every day.
But you know, Representative DeFazio last week, you were watching the hearings. He said, look, there was an email that was sent from a Boeing chief technical pilot that Dennis Muilenburg and some of the executives were aware of. That essentially brought to light this question of whether or not executives were aware of concerns with MCAS. Was the board aware of that before the Ethiopia crash?
Let me separate the IM. First of all, the IM was discovered and turned over to the authorities that we were meant to turn it over to. The question you're asking is when it was written. Was it surfaced then as a concern? Was it fleshed out? Is there a broad culture question? The answer is it wasn't. Do we wish it had? Yes. Would it have resulted in something different around that assumption that went wrong? I'm not so sure of that. I would hope that it would, but none of that happened. So our job is to make sure that it will happen. I do not believe that instance, that isolated instance, is indicative of a culture problem. I have not seen that in the many touches that I have had.
And because you know that yesterday, Representative DeFazio and Representative Larson, they sent a letter to the rest of the committee, and they essentially said there's a culture of concealment, of not being 100% upfront when it comes to safety.
Yeah, and I just don't see that. I don't believe it. I have many touch points inside Boeing. I always have. That question of culture and anybody's willingness to trade safety against anything else, never seen it, never touched it, don't believe it. Now, don't confuse that. Our culture on this subject can get better. We can do more with visibility. Everybody knows that. We can strengthen all the independent arms that are meant to put judgment against every decision in favor of safety. We can strengthen those. We can increase sort of the authority across the company. And those are the steps that we are going to take.
Joe?
Dave, in your view, what's the right balance between a company and its employees and the cooperation with regulators in the FAA? Obviously, I can't imagine the FAA trying to certify something without a close working relationship with the company, and yet if it's too close, then you figure that maybe the FAA is doing Boeing's bidding for it. So how do you get that balance right from here on out? Because that's going to be something that people look at closely.
That's a great question. That definitely came up in the hearings. I just don't want anybody to be confused. Reform will happen. Reform has to happen. The system let everybody down. I totally understand that. Delegation of authority over a fairly lengthy period of time has delivered incredibly strong results. The safety record demonstrates that. And the involvement of the most technical of the team at Boeing, their involvement in that process is a good one. If a rebalancing has to happen by way of reform, so be it. So be it. I get that. I think both the FAA and ourselves will look hard at all of these practices. We will attempt to improve them on our own, and we will encourage reform at every turn, all in the name of safety.
Hey, Dave, we have had people, analysts and others who have come on the show and defended Boeing, saying that, look, they think a big part of the problem with this was a lack of pilot training in some of these incidents. Do you think that this was a situation where pilot training wasn't up to snuff, or was this an actual problem with the MCAS system and the design?
Becky, there were a lot of contributing causes. Our job is to fix MCAS and make sure whatever inputs ultimately come about in that cockpit at that moment do not create pandemonium. There is no question the fundamental assumption we designed around was flawed with respect to how a pilot would react. And that's our job, is to fix that assumption and work with that man-machine interface with all of our customers and all of the regulatory authorities around the world. If you ask me, that is the center of the issue that has to be addressed as we go forward and develop every next new airplane.
Dave, I know the sensors were, you had to put trust in that the MCAS was reading. There have been people that said that pilots aren't even flying planes anymore. Is there too much automation at this point? If a pilot was actually more involved with the takeoff than just relying on software and automated systems, would the same thing have happened? Do these guys fly planes anymore?
Well, I can't answer the second part because it's speculative in nature. Pilots do fly airplanes less and less in terms of controlling them in flight. But I do think we're past sort of that moment. We are going to have to deploy automation. We are going to have to ultimately almost make these airplanes fly on their own. Make no mistake, I wouldn't want to get on an airplane without that pilot. Their judgment, their behavior at moments of critical importance that's why I get on an airplane. So forget my life at Boeing. And so we're going to do everything in our power to make their job easier, and it will likely increase the level of automation in the cockpit.
What's Boeing's relationship with the new head of the FAA? He seemed like he was irritated with the company, at least in recent weeks, based on some of the release of some of the information that had gone to the criminal investigation, but not necessarily to the FAA. Can you tell us what the latest development is in that and your latest conversations?
Well, Dennis appropriately apologized for that situation. Nobody's happy about that. He's exercising his independence as a regulator, so I don't even want to suggest there is a relationship. Our respect for the role he is in and our respect for the judgments he has to make over the next month or two. I don't want to suggest we have one. He's doing his work. He's doing it the right way, and he's going to listen to everybody inside his regulatory authority. And make sure that everyone is comfortable that this airplane is, in fact, as safe as we believe it is.
Dave, let me ask you about the airlines, your customers. Gary Kelly, CEO of Southwest, was on our air not long ago, and he's very upset. I mean, he came out and said, I'm not happy with Boeing at all, and they are going to consider looking at Airbus as a possibility to fly in the future. I mean, you guys have been two peas in a pod since they started in 1967. Yep. When he said that, what did you think?
I said sort of good for Gary. Gary I've known for a very long time. He's a fantastic CEO. He's objective about everything. We have let him down. There's no question we have let him down. He was entirely dependent on the Boeing company and the 737 fleet. He has confidence in that fleet. He does. He knows it has served him well, and he knows it has served him safely. But this gap where he needs capacity and it's not there is a real problem for him. Anybody at that moment in time has to make the decision that we're going to consider other alternatives. I get that. So we're going to have to step up to the plate if and when that day happens and put our best foot forward. And we're going to have a MAX back in the air that's flying safely, maybe safer than any airplane that's ever flown.
Does that mean even greater compensation? In other words, cutting the price on the plane?
Compensation that's a decision way long out from now. Right now, we are focused on getting this airplane back in the air. We price airplanes against our competition. We always intend to win, and we always sell value in the process. I don't think anything will change about that.
Becky?
Dave, do you still anticipate that the 737 MAX program will be approved, the new program approved by at least one regulator, and it will be back in the air by the end of the year, at least somewhere in the world?
So I'll reiterate a very important point and a ground rule that everyone set early on inside Boeing. The regulator will make that decision. So I want to state that right up front, and we are going to support everything they do and cross every T and dot every I in the process. We're Right now, that schedule suggests that that what you just said will happen, that in fact our airplane will get certified. And as we turn the year, we can begin to move forward on getting these back in the air. But again, subject always to the FAA's schedule.
Did you want to cut production any further? There's been reports that you have been an advocate for saying either shut down production altogether on the MAX or bring it down even lower than 42 per month. Have you been an advocate for that?
I've been an advocate for stability. And so the planned increases, now, if you'll recall back when these accidents happened and immediately following Ethiopia, I had an objective to take the pressure off the company in every way I could think of. And one of them was to create some stability on the 737 MAX line. At that time, we were running at a fairly low rate, 42, relative to what we were predicting. But my advice, and by the way, this wasn't a debate, accepted readily by the team, was yes, we're going to stay at 42. And why stay at 42? Why not drop to 30? Well, because there's stability involved in our workforce and skills and knowledge that we want to stay the course. We don't want to hurt those folks. We don't want to bump through the union lines. None of that works for us or works for the airplane or works for the name of safety. So we have worked very hard to keep that stable and steady for as long as we can. And we have looked at our balance sheet and all the credit issues that you face in doing so every step of the way. Every month there's a rigor around evaluating that. And our hope, our desire is that we get the certification, we get return to service, and we never have to move off that number.
Joe?
Hey, Dave, the 737 MAX is so important to Boeing. I can't imagine that there'd be a successor airline in the works anytime really, really soon. This needs to be salvaged and saved, obviously. Will people a year or two from now say, yeah, I'm flying on a 737 MAX, and it will be called a 737 MAX? There's no plans to change the name of it, and it will be a proud brand for Boeing eventually, reputationally? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it's possible. The entire company is dedicated to that. Your question started with a phrase I would never use, which is salvage. That's not what this is. That's not what this is.
Okay.
This airplane has been updated several times over the course of its tenure out there, always with the latest technology and safety requirements in mind. So it is a modern airplane, and this control system will be fixed, and it will be safe, and it will have been tested like no other control system, at least in my history in the aviation industry. And this airplane will fly, and it will be safe. And I'll fly it, and my family will fly it. And the only way to win a brand back is not to advertise it or to talk about it, but to win it with every next flight and every touch.
It will be called the MAX.
It will be called the MAX.
No plans to change the name. Okay.
No.
Jim Cramer is tweeting, Dave, and he points out something that Doug Parker from American Airlines has told him recently, that Boeing, he thinks, owes his company hundreds of millions of dollars. Also says that those costs should be borne by Boeing shareholders, not by Americans. What's your response to that?
Well, there's no question there will be settlements, and Doug's right, and Doug's been very clear with me on that front as well as every other CEO that's been affected. So there's no question there will be a fair number of settlements, and yes, our company and our balance sheet has provided for what we think that resolution will be. So there's a lot of work between here and there to resolve that, but yeah, we understand that, and Doug's right, and we intend to satisfy him.
Do you think your company is getting drawn into the trade talks and now potentially used as a pawn in what's happening between China and the United States right now?
Well, I certainly hope not, and I'm going to operate under the premise that it will not. Trade is a completely separate discussion. It's big and it's important to the Boeing company long term, but in no way, shape, or form should anything get in the way of the subject of safety and the recertification effort.
Dave, we don't have much time left, but one last question we have for you is, I think there is a perception that the board, you talk every once in a while, not every month, but every couple of days. How often does the board talk? How often are you guys saying, here's where we stand on the MAX, here's what needs to be done?
I don't think a week goes by where I haven't talked to at least 2 or 3 board members, at least, to gain perspectives, to inform them, to make sure that we are up to date on everything. Reminder, every day we get an update, a complete update on the status of the MAX and what's happening with the software development, release, approval, certification, et cetera. So this is a very involved board. Admiral Giambastiani, who has led our safety efforts and drive deep into the company, he's done an amazing job. You'd think he was working full-time on this. I think most of our team believe he is, and we thank him for that service. This is a very involved board. It's doing its very best to cope with a very difficult situation. We are not trying to rewrite history. We are simply trying to take every next half step forward the right way.
Joe?
Yeah, Dave, Boeing, for years, one of the most respected names in the world, respected company. And you worked with Jim McNerney for a long time. And those, I don't know whether I'd call them the glory years at Boeing, but obviously he had a very successful tenure. Is Muilenburg capable of, do you think, returning Boeing to those days? Did Boeing lose a step when it lost McNerney? Or I know that's a tough thing to ask, but go ahead.
Yeah, let's just talk. There were 2 very different eras. And you may remember that when Jim came in as CEO, he came in under dire circumstance based on a serious compliance issue in the defense side of our business. And he brought our company back from that, and he did it really, really well. This situation's very different. Dennis came to us highly qualified. He is an engineer. That is helpful. But he also ran big businesses inside Boeing. He knows how to design airplanes. He delivers airplanes, and he has provided them safely to his customers, and he responds to them when he's asked questions. So he came in qualified, and now he is going to experience in his first period one of the most difficult situations any CEO that I've ever known has lived through. So if he can get us from here to the end point, and the end point being a MAX that's flying in service and accepted by the flying public, and begins to restore our brand, I might argue he's just about the most qualified executive in the world to be running a company like Boeing. So all of us have been through that CEO chair, know how tough and gritty these experiences are. We're going to support Dennis through this process, and I hope when we get to the end of this, and we're not going to project when we get or how we get, but if we get there the way I think we will, Dennis is going to be one highly qualified CEO.
All right, we're going to leave it. We're going to leave it there. Dave Calhoun, Chairman of Boeing, thank you very much for the extended interview. Phil LeBeau, thank you very much for bringing it to us from CNBC headquarters. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you.